4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of Endeavour.
When you look out into space in the world we live in today, you can take heart knowing that there are many out there in our world trying to figure out every nook and cranny of it. And for decades, various space agencies around the world have sent all sorts of craft into the starry sky to try and learn more from it. And it's been fun. But right now, the company that is changing the game at a rapid level is SpaceX. So much so that people talk about it more than NASA. And given how long one has been around compared to the other, that might lead you to ask, what's the difference between NASA and SpaceX? Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Number 5, outlining the basic differences. Let's start off with the basics and work our way from there, shall we? It's a bit easy to confuse SpaceX and NASA and not realize what the two actually do and why the latter has come to rely on the former, which is obviously not how this all started out, but is becoming more and more of a thing as time goes on. Both are space companies and have their own support structure that they use to craft various things. But when you look under the hood, you see the differences pretty clearly. For example, SpaceX is a private company under the direction of one person, Elon Musk, that currently builds and launches 2 rockets, the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. The booster stages of these rockets usually return to Earth for refurbishment, which saves money and helps SpaceX undercut competitors' prices. SpaceX also builds and flies Dragon, a space capsule that can carry crew and cargo to the International Space Station. This particular craft has done that multiple times and is getting more efficient with every launch. SpaceX is also working on a large rocket and spacecraft system called Starship that will be able to carry massive payloads to space. Starship may eventually ferry people to Mars for permanent habitation. More on that later, as that's another thing the two are handling differently. The company is also deploying a massive constellation of small satellites called Starlink, intended to provide global high-speed internet access. The satellites, which number around 1,000 at present, have sparked controversy because of concerns they might create light pollution and interfere with astronomical research. But that's another topic entirely. So that right there outlines what SpaceX does, and as you can see, they do quite a bit. NASA, meanwhile, is a taxpayer-funded U.S. government agency with more than a dozen locations around the country, versus SpaceX that has 1 or 2 main locations in places like Texas. It reports to the executive branch, and the president appoints its administrator. Congress legislatively authorizes NASA's activities and provides its annual budget. NASA's budget is set through a political process and is not distributed evenly. Nearly half of NASA's budget goes to human spaceflight programs. For much of the public, the most visible of these programs is the International Space Station, a permanently crewed, multinational space laboratory in low Earth orbit. NASA is also working to send astronauts to the Moon and Mars through the Artemis program. About a third of NASA's budget goes to its science division, which includes planetary science, earth science, astrophysics, and heliophysics. NASA launches space missions to research and explore planets and other worlds, study Earth's climate, answer fundamental questions about the nature of the universe, and study the sun. The differences may seem subtle, but they're there, and they're important, because they outline just how different they are fundamentally. And those very fundamental differences have a huge impact on what each company can do and is allowed to do. Number 4, a boss versus the boss. Let's rewind the clocks back to the 1960s. It was in that decade that humanity as a whole had a mission: get to the moon. Spurred on by the words of President John F. Kennedy, NASA was working harder than ever to go and get to the moon before the Soviet Union could. The space race was on, and eventually, the United States won the space race via Apollo 11. Led by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, humanity set foot on the surface of the moon, and humanity was set for its next age. Or at least, that's what everyone thought when the space race was on. Because as time went on, the luster of going to the moon multiple times and getting space rocks just didn't matter to the people of the planet anymore. In fact, Apollo 13 was questioned by many taxpayers because they wanted to know why we should keep going to the moon after we'd already been there. And as the decades went on and the cost of making new shuttles rose, not to mention the tragedies that befell craft like the Challenger, it just became more clear to the government that NASA wasn't as needed in the space shuttle department. That's why by the 90s and the 2000s, the budget of NASA was slashed heavily, and they couldn't exactly get more money since they were a government-run entity that depended on taxpayer dollars and government approval. SpaceX, though, doesn't have that problem, and thus they have way more freedom in more ways than one. Because for them, their boss is Elon Musk. It's his company, unlike Tesla, where he's just the CEO and didn't found it despite what many think. And he built it to go and get a new space race on so that humanity could find itself loving space again and trying to reach it once more. At any given moment, the government could decide to go and pull the plug on NASA's funding, and when that happens, they'll have another low point in creation because they'll be very limited in what they do. For SpaceX, that problem doesn't exist so long as the company continues to make money. And it is doing just that, including making money from NASA as they use the SpaceX rockets and craft as noted earlier. And they don't break any major national or international laws, for which now they haven't done. For now. That's another subtle difference, but an important one, because who controls your checks and what might persuade them to think otherwise is often a block towards true creation, which, if you think about it, is another difference. Number 3, focus. Think back to when we talked about the basic differences between SpaceX and NASA. One thing we outlined was all the things that each company was doing, and if you listened closely, you'll notice that NASA has a much wider net than SpaceX. They're not just going and studying how to make starships and satellites. They're studying, researching, and examining space and Earth as a whole. They're working hard on multiple fields of study, to the extent that they are expanding our field of knowledge in space by leaps and bounds with various things they do, including putting yet another rover on Mars as of late. That rover will give them data to research and process, and that's honestly something that SpaceX doesn't do. Because their focus, pure and simple, is to get humanity back to the stars, and then beyond. Starlink is a side project from Musk's mind. Why does that difference matter? Resources. As noted, NASA's budget is funneled into various projects across the program, whereas SpaceX is much more focused in what it does. Yes, it makes various kinds of crafts and engines, but that's still under one banner. Plus, they've gotten pretty good at making those craft as they keep getting used. So by focusing more on that than anything else and leaving the science stuff to actual scientists, SpaceX can move things along a lot faster than NASA can. Number 2, failure is always an option. If you're looking for a way in which NASA and SpaceX are similar, we can help you with that. They're similar in that they're prone to failure at times. NASA has lost a lot of people in misfires and faulty parts like with the original Apollo mission, and almost losing the entire crew on Apollo 13. While SpaceX has never lost a person on one of their craft, many of their craft have blown up, either upon launch or landing back on Earth. The difference, though, is that when a major failure happens at NASA, it can take a long time to recover due to the government and people's thoughts on the matter. When SpaceX fails, they look over what they did wrong and they get right back to work. They know failure is always an option, and they use that failure to try and make sure it doesn't happen again. Number 1, Mars. Both NASA and SpaceX are trying to get to Mars, but how they're approaching it is entirely different. SpaceX has said that they want to colonize Mars this decade. NASA has been a little more lenient in its expectations to go and colonize Mars. Furthermore, SpaceX is working as hard as it can to focus on getting to Mars, almost with unilateral vision, but NASA has its attention divided, including getting us back to the moon before Mars. So if you were to place a bet on who would win the race to Mars, SpaceX has a lot more going for it. So what do you think? What do you think of this look at the various differences between NASA and SpaceX? Are you surprised by how some of these differences stand out from the others? Which organization do you feel is better run and getting better results at this point in time? Who do you think will get to Mars first? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the channel.